Greetings, welcome back. Today we are in Mark chapter 3. We're starting in verse 1 and going through verse 19. This is three different stories: healing the man on the Sabbath, the throwing out of a demon, and calling the 12 disciples. Now, the first story where Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath follows on the heels of Jesus and his disciples being confronted by the Pharisees over picking grain on the Sabbath day. There was a confrontation where Jesus talks about eating on the Sabbath and compares what he and his disciples are doing to David eating the bread of the presence when it was not right for him to eat that bread. Now, here we have Jesus probably on the same day, maybe not. It could be that Mark is just conflating two stories that take place on the Sabbath so that we get a feel for the way Jesus interacts with the Pharisees about the Sabbath. In other words, these are thematically linked, but it is likely that Jesus and the Pharisees had two confrontations on one day. That would make sense. The confrontation that starts with Jesus and his disciples on the road, they walk together, they have this interaction, this meeting of the minds, and it culminates in Jesus interacting with them around this healing. Now, that being said, we don't know. We don't know who this man was. Could he have been a plant from the Pharisees? Could they have planted this man in the crowd? Could Jesus have planted this man in the crowd? Could they have all known about this man and Jesus just decided that today is the day where he's going to heal this man? We don't know. It does seem a little bit suspicious that Jesus has this confrontation with the Pharisees on the way to the synagogue, and then this paralyzed man just shows up at the meeting. It's very likely that either the Pharisees or Jesus or both knew this man, and that the confrontation that started over grain is now going to culminate in Jesus healing this man. So it is likely that either the Pharisees or Jesus use this situation to continue the conversation that they were having on the way to the synagogue that morning. So what happens is Jesus comes into the synagogue, he sees this man, and he heals him. The man has what is termed a withered hand. He has a hand that doesn't work properly, and Jesus heals him. Now, healing in this time was seen as work, at least if it was non-essential healing. Now, obviously, healing to save a person's life, to bring life to a person, that was considered okay. That was not a violation of Sabbath. In other words, if in today's language somebody had an ER visit, there weren't ERs at the time, but if somebody was in a need of life-saving medical treatment, that could have been provided. That was not considered work. That was considered necessary for the Sabbath, or is necessary healing for life. Therefore, it was good to do on the Sabbath. What the Pharisees are going to accuse Jesus of is practicing a type of healing, a type of medical treatment that was not necessary and therefore could have waited until the next day. They could have waited till Sunday. So their argument is that this healing did not have to take place on the Sabbath. Because it did not have to take place on the Sabbath, Jesus could have waited until the following day to perform it, and therefore he was doing work on the Sabbath. That's their argument. That's their line of thinking, that anything that doesn't necessarily take place on the Sabbath can wait another day. Jesus, though, is arguing that anything that brings life and is not done for money, those are two different elements of Jesus's argument. Whatever brings life and is not done to bring in money is therefore good for the Sabbath. In other words, had Jesus been healing this man so that the man would pay him a fee, that would not have been acceptable. But Jesus was bringing life to this man and was not accepting money for it. Therefore, he is not working. He is bringing life to the world. And that, by definition, according to Deuteronomy, is the purpose of Sabbath. Sabbath is about bringing life to the world. So what Jesus is not saying that Sabbath is unimportant. He is not telling the Pharisees that their law does not matter. Rather, Jesus is just having an interpretive discussion with the Pharisees. What is lawful on the Sabbath? It's not that the Sabbath isn't important. What is lawful? What is good? For the Pharisees, it is only those things that are necessitated by the situation. For Jesus, anything that brings life is good. So if we were to take the argument into our present day, the Pharisees might argue that only necessary work is good and lawful on the Sabbath. Only the things that are necessary to keep you alive. And honestly, if you can prepare it the day before, that's even better. For Jesus, anything that brings life and goodness into the world and isn't done for profit or gain is in keeping with Sabbath. So when we approach these passages like these ones in the end of Mark 2 and the beginning of Mark 3, we shouldn't be looking at Jesus as overturning the Sabbath. We should be looking at Jesus and saying, how is he reinterpreting the Sabbath? How is he bringing new meaning and new light to the Sabbath? The next passage is Jesus going out into Tyre and Sidon. And here he heals or exorcises a demon. And again, Mark continues this theme. The healing is done by physical contact, physical touch, but the exorcising of demons is done without physical touch. Jesus will not touch the demon possessed. He will only touch those who are in need of healing. But the two things that are very important here is, number one, Jesus goes out to the surrounding countryside, and Tyre and Sidon are prominent in this chapter or this passage. Tyre and Sidon are named not because that is the region exclusively, but because those two cities have connotations in the Old Testament of being very Gentile dominated. In other words, Jesus probably was still going to Jewish communities within this region. There would have been probably fairly large Jewish communities in this region. Jesus isn't going to these cities to reach out to Gentiles as a historical context. He's going to reach out to Jews. But these cities have Gentile connotations for Mark's readers. So this is Jesus reaching out into the larger community, into the Gentile community, to perform the kinds of miracles that he had been doing exclusively in and around Galilee. So he's going out into the larger world. He is now being inclusive of Gentiles. And this is an important step for Jesus because we haven't really seen that so far. It's not going to last incredibly long, but we are going to see Jesus go into different areas that are Gentile dominant and minister to those people, trying to show that the Jewish Messiah is reaching out into the wider world. The only other thing that I really want to highlight here, it comes in verse 11, where the demon says of Jesus, you are God's son. You will remember the first time Jesus cast out a demon back in chapter 1, the demon says, you are the Holy One of God. Now, the Holy One of God is a pretty high title. That's usually reserved for somebody like a prophet or a priest. It means you're pretty special. But to say the Son of God, the demons are kind of upping the name of Jesus. They're giving him a better title in this passage. And again, we have to ask, are they doing it because they are coming to recognize who Jesus is and they can't help but um, can't help but talk about Jesus in the right terms? Like they now understand Jesus is Son of God, and so they have to address him that way? Or are they simply doing this? Are the demons simply doing this to give people the wrong impression of Jesus? Are they saying Jesus is the Son of God, hoping that people will misinterpret Jesus and look at him as a dominant figure who is there to do miracles, perform signs, take over the world? Are they trying to use the truth in a way that will harm how Jesus is received in the wider community? Those are they're two very different possibilities. One is that they are compelled to speak the truth simply because they are compelled. The other is they are using the truth to manipulate people to see in Jesus what the people want to see and not what Jesus wants them to see. And that's something we have to wrestle with a little bit because the text does not come out and say it. I encourage you to think about that. That's one of the takeaway questions, I think, from this chapter is, how do you see the demons interacting with Jesus? Why are they being honest about who Jesus is? Why are they acknowledging him with this new and better title? The last of these sections that Mark that we're taking in this section is Jesus calling the 12 apostles. Now, it is important to recognize that while we talk about the 12 apostles, there is no definitive list of the 12. The Gospels present different lists. We don't know exactly who made up these 12. There are some names that are on every list, like Peter, Andrew, James, John. They're on every list. But there are other disciples that are on this list that aren't on, say, Luke's list. And what that tells us is it was not important who the 12 were. The importance of the 12 is in their symbolic number. They represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, if you go back to the Old Testament, there were more than 12 tribes of Israel. Depending on how you count them, there were actually more tribes. And one is always omitted so that you get 12. The same is true with Jesus. 12 is a symbolic number, it's a round number, and Jesus is trying to echo the 12 tribes. So when you see the conflicting names, we don't have to harmonize them. We do not have to say, oh, this person goes by this name here and this name here. No. Jesus had a lot of followers. And just because people couldn't remember who the original 12 were, isn't that important. It's just simply a symbolic number that Jesus used in order to give his ministry a little more meaning. Notably absent from this list is Levi. Levi is notably absent because so far he is the only disciple. There are 5 disciples with call stories: Simon, Andrew, James, and John, and Levi is the only one not mentioned here. Now, tradition associates him with Matthew, but this tradition is probably a little bit skewed. It's probably not accurate because it is unlikely that somebody would have 2 Hebrew names and go by both without them being grouped together. It's just not likely at all. In fact, it's highly unlikely that Levi and Matthew are the same person. So what is more likely is Levi just got left out of this, and that's okay. Again, Jesus had a lot more disciples than 12. Simply because our Sunday school teaches us that Jesus had 12 disciples doesn't mean we need to be locked into this concept. Jesus probably had, 30, 40 disciples who came and went. Some followed him more than others. Some probably had to work and could only be there on the weekends or however they were able to fit into Jesus' schedule. They all had a part. And simply because one disciple isn't mentioned here, we shouldn't get bent out of shape. It is curious, though, that we have this list and that we have James, the son of Alphaeus, and Levi was a son of Alphaeus. It could be that these are brothers. We don't know. Alphaeus is not exactly a common name, so it is possible that these two are brothers and that somehow they just found Jesus together, but never seem to appear in the same story, unlike the other sets of brothers. It's just odd. It's just a little odd. We also see that 3 of the disciples get nicknames. James and John are called the sons of thunder, and Simon is called Peter or Rock. Now, this is kind of cool because unlike Matthew, Mark does not give us a reason for Jesus giving nicknames. But we do notice that these are the 3 who are always around Jesus. They seem to be the tightest. Kind of like if you remember in Samuel where David's officers are listed. He has different groups. He has different groups of officers who are included in the lists based on their exploits. And the tightest bunch was the group of 3. And here again, we have a group of 3. Jesus seems to have 3 levels of circles: disciples, the 12, and then the 3. And this is the innermost band, and they are the ones to get nicknames. Now, when we hear these nicknames, we might be tempted to think that these are really cool and that we want them. I mean, Sons of Thunder, Peter, as in Rock, these are pretty good nicknames, except that when you think about their personality traits of these individuals, James and John, throughout the rest of this book, are going to come off as hot-headed. They're the ones who want to call down fire on towns. They are the ones who are asking Jesus to be on his left and right. They're very arrogant, very boastful. When they're talking, they are representing kind of this hot-headed nature. And it very well might be that Sons of Thunder is a negative view on that tendency. It might be that Jesus is calling them hotheads because they just spout off whatever seems good to them in the time. Peter, if you look at his character throughout the rest of the book, he's stubborn. He is the one who is dense. He doesn't seem to get it when Jesus talks to him. He's always making kind of dumb remarks to Jesus. He's the one who tells Jesus he cannot die. He's the one who says to Jesus, let's build tents or dwelling places for you and Moses and Elijah. He's the one who will deny Jesus. When Jesus has said, you're going to deny me, he says, no, I won't. It might be that Peter, Rock, means hard-headed or dense. And what's really kind of cool about this, other than Jesus having a sense of humor and a sense of irony here, and really having a lot more personality than we sometimes give him credit for, what is really kind of cool about this is that when Mark's gospel was written, all 3 of these individuals would have been well known in the church. These were the earliest saints in the church. These were the people that every Christian would have looked up to. They would have really seen as saintly and Christ-like, because that's who these individuals became later in life. And it would have been odd and a little probably disturbing for these early Christians to see Peter, James, and John in this light, where they are rough around the edges, where they have a lot of growing to do, and being highlighted for their negative character traits. These are the kinds of things that we don't often see in our heroes. And it's really kind of cool that the first Christian gospel seems to identify these earliest followers of Jesus by their most negative characteristics, and gives us something to look up to, not in the fact that they got it all right, but in the fact that they grew and developed the more time they spent with Jesus. So that where they started off was nowhere near where they finished. And it's just, it is something that we can take heart in when we don't get it right the first time, that we will eventually come to know Jesus, and coming to know Jesus will change our character the way it did for Peter, James, and John. Anyway, that's where I want to leave it. I'm going to pick it up for the second half of chapter 3 in the next video. Thanks for joining.